The woman mistook the Nazis standing before her for a relative from her homeland, someone who had come to liberate her. What she never could have imagined, even in her dreams, was that her would earn her nothing but a one-way ticket to death. The Nazi officer silently accepted her affection, only to suddenly crush her throat without warning. This was because, deep down to his very bones, he despised anyone who had betrayed their country. However, his brutal act was accidentally witnessed by a village woman. Though panic-stricken, he knew he had to eliminate this problem, so he immediately chased after her. Yet when the village woman looked at the Nazi who had been stabbed straight through the heart, she was momentarily at a loss. What she never expected was that what began as a single act of passion-fueled killing would escalate into a massacre, with almost no one spared. And just 2 days earlier, this place had looked completely different. In the winter of 1941, on Germany's eastern front in Ukrainian territory, a small unit of retreating German soldiers wandered through the mountains and forests, desperate for rest and supplies. They were quickly approaching a nearby village. This remote mountain village was as peaceful as ever, with only a few children playing war games in the snow, completely unaware that danger was closing in. Before long, the unit finished surrounding a large house, but when they stormed inside, they were shocked to find that the room held only an elderly woman confined to a sickbed. And even more surprising was that she spoke fluent German.
Wie viel gute Tier steht die? Kto wiadomy?
Außer mir sind alle in der Kirche.
Sie sprechen Deutsch?
Natürlich.
Wer hat die Befehlsgewalt hier im Ort?
Based on the clues provided by the old woman, the unit quickly located the village leader's home and executed him on the spot. They then swiftly surrounded the entire church. Hearing the gunshots, the villagers immediately stopped praying, but the moment they stepped outside the church, they were taken under German control. After confirming that the villagers could communicate in German, the German lieutenant lowered his originally imposing posture and promised that as long as they cooperated, no harm would come to them. His words were filled with a clear attempt at reassurance, yet the villagers under the gun barrel showed none of the panic one might expect, instead calmly accepting the lieutenant's terms. As a result, the soldiers went door to door collecting weapons from the villagers, and throughout the entire process, everyone cooperated fully. One elderly man even voluntarily handed over a sword for self-defense, an heirloom over 120 years old that his great-grandfather had once worn while serving in the 2nd Cavalry Regiment. Seeing the sincerity with which the old man presented the antique, the soldier returned that trust in kind and allowed him to keep the keepsake. However, beneath this seemingly tolerant attitude, a deadly oversight was quietly taking shape. The rifle hidden behind Martha's front door was overlooked, and this omission became the direct catalyst for the village massacre. At the same time, the situation of the entire village was thoroughly understood. The village was inhabited only by the elderly, the weak, women, and children, all descendants of ethnic Germans from Russia who had migrated here 200 years ago and still spoke German as their mother tongue, because they had long suffered under Stalin's policies. Most of them welcomed the arrival of the small unit and even hoped to be rescued by their own people. Even so, the skittish unit, like startled birds, still did not dare to let down their guard. That night, they chose to detain all the village's children together to ensure safety. Compared to handing over weapons, this measure was far harder for the villagers to accept. One village woman, Ursula, was scolded by her child's grandmother for the entire night because of it. On the other hand, communicating in German greatly reduced the hostility between the two sides. The wounded soldier Nastor also received care from the village women. They even used crude veterinary methods to remove the bullet from his body.
Gleich hast du es überstanden.
And for this the lieutenant expressed his gratitude to the women, for the soldiers who had been on edge for so long. This night finally offered a rare chance to breathe. One soldier who performed magic tricks brought laughter to everyone. Even the detained children forgot their fear for a moment. But this behavior was harshly reprimanded by the lieutenant when he entered the room. It turned out that what the soldier was playing with was not a coin, but the medal the lieutenant had obtained after countless brushes with death. Because to the lieutenant, this medal was his angel and his protective charm. At the same time, Martha got into a fierce argument with the villagers. She strongly insisted on reporting the German incursion to the authorities, hoping to clear the villagers of the stigma of being seen as traitors by the Soviets. But her proposal was met with almost unanimous opposition. Years of oppression had stripped the villagers of their trust in the government, and even her own sister refused to support her.
Verhalt dich einmal im Leben ruhig. Wenigstens für mein Kind.
Yet in the face of everyone's objections, Martha still stood by her decision. So early the next morning, She took the rifle the soldiers had missed and prepared to report the German unit to the authorities. Watching the stubborn Martha, her sister, knowing she could no longer persuade her, said nothing more. But when Martha was off guard, her sister painfully struck her and locked her in the woodshed. This was also an act of helplessness on the sister's part. After all, she could not just watch her sister walk straight into danger. Meanwhile, in order to gain more time to rest, the German unit continued to show goodwill toward the villagers, and after the earlier dispute, the villagers also showed greater expectations toward the Germans. While soldiers were helping the village woman Helga repair her tractor, she spoke to the lieutenant with hopeful anticipation.
Herr Leutnant, wenn Sie zurück zu den Truppen kommen,
Ja,
erzählen Sie, dass es hier auch Deutsche gibt, die auf Rettung hoffen.
versprochen.
Thus, the entire day passed in apparent harmony. Young soldiers and single village women quietly developed feelings for one another. A soldier who dreamed of becoming a football player felt an instant connection with the girl Gerda, as if they had met too late in life. The soldier Rudy, whose brother was a steelworker, found endless topics to discuss with Hilda, the blacksmith's daughter. Even the mild-mannered soldier Schultz chatted endlessly with Ursula. The whole village showed no sign at all of being occupied by enemy troops. After a full day of work, the soldiers repaired the tractor, but this caused the unit to miss their window to move on, forcing them to stay in the village for another night. Unexpectedly, that night the lieutenant allowed the villagers to take back their detained children. This decision created a rare sense of trust toward the German soldiers among the villagers. Overjoyed, Ursula even kissed the lieutenant on the cheek, and that very evening, villagers who felt indebted to the Germans came together to thank the unit, bringing fine food and wine. As the drinks flowed, both sides sang and danced, chatting happily, turning the night into what looked like a joint celebration. Yet beneath the seemingly harmonious atmosphere, the suspicion and disdain in the eyes of the German soldiers never truly faded. The village woman Ursula first confessed her feelings to Schultz and was rejected, then instead invited the lieutenant to dance. He coldly turned away and left. She was even slapped in the face by the violent short soldier Nocel. Throughout the night, the seemingly peaceful village was already filled with undercurrents, because two deadly crises were taking shape, and they would soon tear apart this fragile illusion of harmony. One was that the lonely Helga had fallen for the lieutenant. The other was that Ursula's son Maxim, trying to protect his mother, stole the medal the lieutenant regarded as his protective charm. And while villagers and soldiers were drinking and laughing together, Martha, who had been restrained by her sister, tricked her nephew into opening the door and escaped. At the same time, the lieutenant, who had left the banquet, was walking through the village and unknowingly arrived at Helga's doorstep. His casual greeting upon entering was met with Helga's warm hospitality. Just as Helga, wrapped in his arms, felt a long-lost sense of warmth, disgust began to rise within the lieutenant. The accumulation of that disgust ultimately drove him to kill Helga. And this was the scene where the story began. Early the next morning, while the soldiers were still discussing the lieutenant's absence overnight, they were drawn by the heart-wrenching cries of villagers in the distance. When they saw the brutally killed owner of the tractor, they first expressed sympathy and then tried to prove their innocence, but all of it was met with furious shouting from Helga's family, and their sense of guilt faded away. Very soon, however, the soldiers were once again plunged into overwhelming fear and rage. They discovered the lieutenant's body in the mountains and forests, where he had not returned all night. From that moment on, the village's fragile peace was completely shattered.
Wir teilen uns auf.
The German unit began a frenzied retaliation.
Keine falsche Bewegung! Weg mit dem!
Yet even with a bayonet pressed against her neck, Martha still refused to confess. But Hilda, who was held down in a water barrel and left barely alive, agreed to the soldiers' interrogation in a dazed state.
Jetzt sagen Sie es uns doch endlich.
Es war die Müllerin. Diese Ursula Wagner, stimmt's?
Ursula war's.
The soldiers then quickly seized the completely unaware Ursula at her home, and she became the nominal murderer of the lieutenant, because there were not only witnesses, but also physical evidence, and that evidence was precisely the protective charm her son had stolen to protect her, the lieutenant's medal. From that point on, Ursula had no way to defend herself, and even Schultz, who had gotten along well with her, was powerless to help. Ursula was then dragged away.
Schnauze!
Seien Sie bloß froh, dass wir Sie und den Jungen am Leben lassen.
Faced with the brutal violence of the German soldiers, the villagers began to realize that death was drawing closer and closer. At this moment, the blacksmith's daughter was already drowning in deep guilt, and when Martha encouraged them to rise up and fight back, the villagers were no longer as resistant as they had been before, but unarmed as they were, they had no idea how to face any of this, yet Martha had already sworn to fight on, and she was the first to rush out. The soldiers once again dragged over the village woman who knew veterinary skills, but the soldier who had once dreamed of becoming a football player was now a bloody mess. Soon, all the anger they needed to vent was directed at the desperately pleading Ursula. They then dragged Ursula out and placed a noose around her neck. Among all the soldiers, Schultz always believed Ursula was innocent, and so he refused to carry out the execution. Just as the soldier preparing to execute her was about to act, a gunshot suddenly rang out from the distance. The executioner fell in response, and gunfire erupted throughout the village. At this moment, the German soldiers' violence finally ignited the villagers' fury, and they began to fight back. Here was Maxim's grandmother, raising her gun and firing at the Germans. There was an old man driving his ancestral saber into a soldier's chest. Although they were all cut down by German gunfire, their willingness to trade their lives for lives began to make the soldiers feel fear. After a brief standoff, the outnumbered Martha was finally captured by the German soldiers and shot on the spot. Witnessing scene after scene of bloody killing made Ursula, with the noose around her neck, feel overwhelming terror, her cries for help unceasing.
Jetzt halt endlich dein verdammtes Maul!
Before long, the village gradually fell silent, but upon seeing her sister killed by the German soldiers, Martha's sister was overwhelmed with grief. Meanwhile, Hilda also broke free from the shadow of guilt, and at this moment, awakened at last, they finally picked up the rifles in their hands. On the other side, because the soldier who dreamed of playing football could not be saved, the village woman with veterinary skills was subjected to extreme humiliation by No-Cell and was brutally beaten to death.
Ihr seid doch alle nur dreckige, stinkende Wilde. Ihr lebt unter Hammer und Sichel und kriegt eure Kinder auf dem Feld. Ihr seid eine Schande für eure Vorfahren. Ihr seid keine Deutschen.
Und ihr folgt Hitler. Ihr verbrennt Bücher von Freud, Brecht und Heinrich Heine. Ihr seid keine Deutschen.
No-Cell, on the verge of a mental breakdown, even shot Schultz when he stepped forward to stop him. Yet when Gerda witnessed the horrific deaths of her fellow villagers, she still appeared reluctant to part with the soldiers who were preparing to flee. What no one knew was that the grief and rage in Gerda's heart had already reached its limit, and she decided to see them off one last time before they left.
Wollt ihr den Eintopf mitnehmen? Ich denke, ihr habt einen weiten Weg vor euch.
Moment, warte mal. Was mit dir?
Das ist jetzt nicht euer Ernst. Schmeckt echt fantastisch.
Halt, warte noch!
No one could have imagined that a seemingly fragile village woman would choose mutual destruction rather than let the German soldiers escape. This resolute will to resist was powerful enough to shatter the arrogance of the German soldiers. Witnessing this scene, the three surviving soldiers, Rudy, Willie, and No-Cell, fled in panic, but they were soon confronted by armed village women in pursuit. The combat effectiveness expected of professional soldiers completely collapsed at this moment. With morale shattered, their only wish was to escape this village burning with rage as quickly as possible. In the end, the three soldiers were pinned down by gunfire and hid inside a barn. As the two sides entered a standoff, the three soldiers turned on each other over disagreements about retreat. At such a life-or-death moment, this internal conflict was fatal. Eventually, an emotionally unhinged Willie strangled the hot-tempered No-Cell. When Willie and Rudy fled the barn, Willie was shot by Martha's sister, who had set up an ambush. Tragically, Martha's sister was also killed by gunfire during the exchange. Now only Rudy and Hilda remained facing each other. As they aimed their guns at one another, time seemed to freeze in that instant. At that moment, Hilda remembered the soldier who once stood in the blacksmith's house, talking endlessly with her.
Ich habe 5 Geschwister. 3 Brüder und 2 Schwestern. Ich vermisse die Bande, das kann ich Ihnen sagen. Sie müssen keine Angst haben. Wenn wir wiederkommen, dann hissen wir hier gemeinsam die deutsche Fahne.
After a brief pause, Hilda slowly lowered her gun first, severely wounded. Willie knew he could not hold on any longer, so he took out his diary and handed it to Rudy.
Schrieb mir ein,
Alles, was du willst.
die Welt muss erfahren, was wir hier angerichtet haben.
Versprochen.
Later, on her way back to the village, Hilda encountered the advancing Soviet Red Army, but aside from a few surviving children, the village was filled with corpses. Meanwhile, the soldier who had been treated by the village woman with veterinary skills also regained consciousness. Just as he was about to leave with the surviving girl who stood beside Gerda's body, the girl broke free and walked away, followed by 2 gunshots. This soldier, once pulled back from the brink of death by the villagers, was sent into hell once again. When the girl walked outside with the gun in her hands, she ran into the Soviet convoy entering the village. At that moment, Hilda, sitting in the vehicle, embraced the girl in her arms as a mother. The convoy carried the survivors away from the village, taking with it the loneliness of all those who had been killed, and the mountain village returned to silence. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Rudy, the sole survivor of the German unit, tore out the diary Willie had entrusted to him, page by page, and threw them into the campfire. In the end, he broke his promise and destroyed the evidence. The film slowly comes to an end here, with its cold and restrained storytelling. This film shatters the myth of war heroes and profoundly reveals the dual themes of war and human nature. War has always been a meat grinder. Once violence is set in motion, everyone becomes a falling domino. Regardless of good or evil, war also forces human nature to shift in an instant. Last night's dancing and affection can turn into ruthless killing by morning. This sudden collapse of humanity is precisely how war utterly destroys conscience. I am a film enthusiast. Feel free to subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time.